Hey Impact High School students, it's Pastor Andy here bringing you guys another message. Yes, we're back on the videos, but only because it's MEA weekend this weekend. So excited to share with you guys the last of our three-part All-In series that we've been doing this fall. We started off week one with asking ourselves the question, how can we get off the sidelines of our faith? Like, why can we get off the sidelines and start living out our faith in a real way? And we kind of explored the story of Moses and how God is all of these different things, and because God is, we can get off the sidelines. And then our last one that we did a couple weeks ago, we were looking at this idea of how do we stay on the field? Like, how do we keep going? How do we, persevere in our faith? How do we keep moving on when things are hard? And what does it look like to honor God in the little things as we're struggling through a battle that we know is already won? But there's still a battle to fight. And so we looked at King Joash of Israel and Elisha in the book of 2 Kings and the conversation that they had and some of the ways where, the king's actions then went on to affect the rest of how his life played out. And so this week we are finishing our All-In series with the story of a guy named Caleb. And Caleb's sort of a minor figure in the Bible. There are not many people who really know about him, but I think he's got a pretty cool story, a pretty cool testimony of his life and how he lived it. And today we're asking ourselves the question, how can we finish the game well? So we're off the sidelines and we're staying on the field and we're fighting hard and we're living out our faith in a real way. We're going all in. How do we finish the game well? Like, how do we end well? How do we finish strong? And I think Caleb's life and Caleb's story will really give us some cool perspective on what that looks like. To set you guys up, if you were to go back and look in the book of Numbers, chapters 13 and 14, you'll see that the people of Israel are traveling on their way to the promised land. They've been rescued out of Egypt. That's going back to Moses again, right? Moses went and he rescued the people out of Egypt. God used him to call the people up and they crossed the Red Sea and they're wandering through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And so they get to the edge of the promised land. And before they just hop in there and start just trying to take stuff over, they decide to send 12 spies into the promised land to check it out. So a spy from each tribe, and they go in there and they're looking around and they're spying out the land and they're noticing that it truly is incredible. I mean, it's the land overflowing with milk and honey, which is an idea that God used to describe the promised land to the people of Israel. It's a land, there's plenty of crops, there's plenty of room, and there's plants everywhere and healthy animals and water and just all the things that they would need to thrive in this area. But the people there are also incredibly strong too. I mean, where there's a lot of resources and a lot of good stuff, there's going to be strong fortified cities and strong armies to fight against as well. And so the spies come back to the people of Israel, and 10 of the 12 spies are like, oh no, it's so bad. They're awful. They're huge. We're never going to do it. We should just go back to Egypt and be slaves again. I mean, like, for real, they give up before they even get started, and they've got all the people of Israel in an uproar, and all the people are freaking out. But a guy named Caleb and Joshua, who maybe is a little bigger figure in the Bible, Joshua of Jericho, the guy who would take over from Moses as the leader of the Israelite people, Joshua and Caleb are these two guys who give a good report. They say, no, listen, like, God is with us. He's going to take care of us. He's going to help us conquer these people. It's a good land. It's a good thing. We can do this. Let's do it together. But the people, they're freaking out and they're crying out. And God says, you know what? If you're not going to trust me, then have it your way. And so he allows the people of Israel to wander in the desert for 40 years. And because of that, all of that generation of people who were doubting God, who refused to go into the promised land, who weren't listening to Caleb and Joshua say, no, God's got it, God's with us, they all died off. And so this new generation rises up, and the only people that didn't die off in that previous generation were actually Caleb and Joshua. They get to go into the promised land, and they're doing all these cool things. And so they start capturing all these cities, and all this great stuff is happening. And that's where we see Caleb in the book of Joshua in chapter 14 having a conversation with Joshua and saying, like, look, here's my life, here's how it's been lived out, and here's how I'm finishing. And so we're going to look and see three reasons, really, like, how we can finish the game well. 3 ways that we can finish the game well from the life of Caleb. And it starts off In chapter 14 of the book of Joshua, verse 6, it says this: Then the people of Judah came to Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him, You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea, Kadesh Barnea, concerning you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought him word again as it was in my heart. So Caleb is talking about like this interaction that we just discussed. But my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt. Yet I wholly followed the Lord my God. So Caleb goes to Joshua and he says, Look, here's the deal. You remember the promise that God made to me because of my faithfulness. I went and I was one of the spies, and when all these other guys were stirring up the people and making them afraid, I gave a good report. I said, no, God's got this. He's with us. Let's do it. I obeyed God in that moment. So really what I see in this moment here, guys, is that the first way that we can finish the game well is by starting well. Caleb started well. In other words, he obeyed when he needed to. He started early on obeying God. He didn't wait till the end of his life to make good choices. He didn't wait till he was old and had all the right resources and the right education and the right stuff. He started well. When he was a young man, he started well and did his duty, and he obeyed God, and he responded to what God was calling him to do. And for you guys in high school, you have the opportunity to start well now. You guys have lived some life. You've probably made some mistakes. You've probably gone through some hurt and some hard things, but you still have so much of your life ahead of you. You still have so much out in front of you. And so I'm inviting you to start well. The first step in finishing the game well is starting the game well. It's a lot easier to win a game when you're up by 40 points in the first half than when you're down by 40 points in the first half. You know what I mean? Like it's easier to finish your paper well and get a great grade on it when you start early and you prepare and you do your research and you start it well. So starting the game well. Then we read on, we continue in verse 9. It says this: And Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have fully followed the Lord my God. So Caleb again talking about, he's like, Joshua, I had this interaction with Moses, and through Moses God promised me these things. And now behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as he said. So instead of dying off in the wilderness, he stayed alive. These 45 years since the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now behold, I am this day 85 years old. So Caleb is an old dude. He's a really old dude because he lived all through this whole generation. It says, I am still as strong today as I was that day Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then for war and for going and coming. So Caleb basically says, I'm 85 and I still feel like a young guy in my, like earlier on in my years. I still feel strong. I'm still capable in battle. I can still travel and do all the things that I need to do. But he recognizes it's not just because he's super buff and does chin-ups every day and push-ups all the time and stuff like that. He says, no, it's because I obeyed God and God has kept me. Like God has kept my strength up. God has provided for me. God has kept me able to do all of these things. And so guys, the second point really that I'm looking at for us, for how we can finish the game well, is by relying well. By relying well on God, by relying on Him to provide for us, for Him to be our source of strength, for Him to be our source of hope, for Him to be our source of peace. Caleb's strength was not his own. And he knew that. He knew that it was from God. So that's the second thing, by relying well. We start well and we rely well. Those are the first two. And then really the big one, the kind of finisher of the whole thing, the way we finish well. Let's read on here in verses 12 through 14. It says this: So now give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day for you, heard on that day how the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out just as the Lord said. Then Joshua blessed him, and he gave Hebron to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, for an inheritance. Therefore Hebron came from the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, to this day because he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. So guys, the real way that we finish the game well is by trusting well. We finish the game well by trusting well. Caleb says, hey, look, I'm trusting that God is going to keep his promise, that you're going to honor the promise that Moses made to me on behalf of God as you're now the leader of Israel. I'm trusting that God is going to keep his promise to me, and that my obedience and all of these things that I've worked for are not going to be in vain, and that you're going to uphold what God has promised over me. And guys, the really cool thing is that God has promised incredible things to all of us. He said, look, I'm building a house, I'm building a place for you in my Father's house. We're going home to heaven. We're going to be with God forever. We're going to be at peace. We're going to be, resting in his hope and in his joy. God has given us all of these really cool promises. And we can finish well by trusting that those promises are true, and that as we continue to rely on him, as we continue to obey him, that he's going to take care of us, and that one day we're going to get to live in the fruit of all of that. We're going to get to be in God's presence. We're going to get to rest with him. We're going to get to enjoy eternity with God because we trust him. And I think because Caleb trusted God's promise and obeyed him, that God honored that. And so a really cool character in Scripture to see Caleb doing these things. He's one of the few people in the Bible actually who doesn't have kind of a really big mess up towards the end of his life. Like even King David, he was this great king of Israel, and then he goes out and he has an affair, and he has one of his close friends murdered, and makes all these bad mistakes. There are so many people in the Bible who kind of have a rough time towards the end of their life because they're sort of have already done their work, really. But Caleb is sort of the shining example against that, where he lives out the rest of his life well. He honors God to the very end, and God honors him for that. And so, guys, my challenge to you for this week is to finish well. Finish the game well, start well, rely well, and trust well, and know that God's got it as we endeavor to live all in our faith. Be looking out, guys. Our next in-person time together will be on the 25th. So be there for life groups for that week. That'll be in your host homes with your life group leaders. And then November 1st, we'll be back here at church for our next high school worship service together and starting a new series that week as well. So looking forward to it, and we'll see you guys then.